Welcome, everyone, to the Playing Books podcast.
It's great to be here.
I'm your host, and I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today. If you are a regular listener, you know exactly what we do here.
We certainly do.
We don't just skim the headlines or, give you the Wikipedia summary.
That is something different.
We take a stack of sources, or in today's case, one massive, formidable object, and we extract the nuggets of knowledge, the mechanics of the arguments, and the stories that define them.
We really try to get under the hood.
We do the heavy lifting so you don't have to, but we also invite you to look closer than you ever have before.
And today, we have a particularly heavy, historically significant task in front of us. We aren't looking at a collection of articles today.
No.
We are looking at a document that, well, arguably shaped the 20th century more than any other text.
That's right. We are analyzing Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. But specifically, and this is crucial for our discussion today, we are looking at Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, the original Stalag complete edition.
The edition is everything here. It's the context.
It is. Now, before we even open the cover, I think we need to set the stage. This isn't a history textbook written in 2024. This is the source material itself. And this specific edition has a fascinating and, frankly, a chilling provenance, doesn't it?
It really does. It's something you feel before you even read the first word. If you look at the front matter of the source we have, there's a stamp on the title page.
Solid.
It's a crude hand-drawn shield with a face, and it says Stalag 357.
Stalag 357. That really grounds this in reality, doesn't it? That was a prisoner of war camp.
Exactly. Located in Poland, and then later is moved into Germany as the front lines collapsed near the end of the war.
So this book was physically there.
It was. And this specific translation was the only complete and officially authorized English translation ever issued by the NSDAP, the Nazi Party.
The only one they officially signed off on.
The only one. And it was found circulating in a POW camp.
Yeah.
So when we read this, we aren't reading a modern academic's interpretation or a sanitized version.
No filter.
None. We are reading the text as it was presented to the English-speaking world by the regime itself, likely intended for propaganda or perhaps for the British prisoners to understand their captors.
Which makes it an incredibly eerie but vital historical artifact. Now, I want to be crystal clear about our mission on this episode of the Playing Books podcast.
This is so important.
We are going to spend the next, a good long while unpacking this text. We are going to look at the stories Hitler tells about his own life, the political theories he lays out, and the psychological insights he claims to have.
Correct. And we need to offer a disclaimer right up front. We are impartially reporting on the content of the book.
Impartially. That is the key word.
We are unpacking the logic, however flawed, dangerous, or frankly, however effective, that is contained in the original source material. We aren't endorsing these viewpoints.
Not in any way, shape, or form.
We are dissecting them to understand the mechanics of how this ideology was constructed. It's a case study in persuasion, in mass psychology, and in the construction of a political movement.
Perfectly said. We're treating this as a forensic analysis. We want to see how the machine was built, bolt by bolt. So let's jump right in. The book is dense. It's divided into two main volumes, but it starts with a story.
It always starts with this story.
It starts with a boy.
It does. It starts with chapter 1, titled My Home. And right away, Hitler frames his own birth as something mystical, almost destined. He writes, "Today I consider it a good omen that destiny appointed Braunau on the Inn to be my birthplace."
Braunau on the Inn. I mean, for most people, that's just a tiny town on the map. Why is that a good omen to him? What's the significance?
It's all about geography. It's right on the frontier between the two German states, Germany and Austria.
Right on the border.
Right. And even in the first paragraph, he's setting up his life's mission. He says the reunion of these two states is a task to which the younger generation should devote their lives.
So he's laying out his foreign policy on page 1.
Absolutely. He writes, and this is a direct quote, "People of the same blood should be in the same Reich."
So, from day one, literally from his birth, he's arguing that borders are artificial and blood is the only real map. That's the foundation for everything that comes after.
Precisely. And he makes a point of saying this union shouldn't happen for economic reasons. In fact, he writes that even if it is economically disadvantageous, it must happen.
That's a fascinating point. He's saying ideology trumps economics.
Completely. Common blood belongs in a common Reich. It establishes the Völkisch, or the racial, the national priority over everything else immediately. He puts his cards on the table from the very beginning.
And he moves immediately from the geopolitical to the intensely personal. He paints a portrait of his parents. And honestly, if you ignore who is writing it, the dynamic he describes is, well, it's incredibly relatable. It's a classic generational conflict.
It is. I think that's part of its rhetorical power. He describes his father as a civil servant, a conscientious man, a self-made man who rose from being the son of a poor cottager to a government official.
So a figure of authority.
A huge figure of authority in the house. Rigid, proud of his pension, proud of his uniform. The father represents the establishment, the system.
And the mother, how does he describe her?
He describes her as loving, caring for the household, devoted to the children. But the text makes it very, very clear. The father was the decision maker, the absolute ruler of the home.
And this leads to the first major conflict of Hitler's life, which he dramatizes heavily, this career struggle.
He spends a lot of time on this.
I found this part fascinating because the father wants what most parents want, security. He wants his son to follow in his footsteps, become a civil servant, get the stamp, get the pension.
Right, and you have to see it from the father's perspective, which Hitler himself lays out. The father, having pulled himself out of poverty, sees the civil service as the pinnacle of success. It's safe, it's respectable.
It's everything he fought for.
Exactly. But Hitler writes about this with intense disdain. I mean, pure contempt. He says the idea of being fettered to an office stool nauseated him.
That's strong language. Fettered, like a prisoner.
He couldn't bear the thought of not being master of his own time, of spending his life filling out forms. He writes that he was by nature not a good boy, in the sense of being docile or obedient.
He's framing himself as a natural-born rebel.
From the very beginning. And then comes the explosion, the flashpoint. At age 12, he announces he wants to be a painter.
An artist. The absolute opposite of a civil servant.
The reaction is visceral. He quotes his father saying, "Artist, not as long as I live, never."
Never.
It's a clash of wills, the father's never versus the son's nevertheless. And Hitler admits to something very revealing here regarding his character, something quite calculating. He sabotaged his own schooling.
He intentionally failed. That's quite a move for a young boy.
He claims he did. He thought that if he did poorly in the technical subjects his father valued, the subjects that would lead to a bureaucratic career, the old man would be forced to let him pursue art.
So it's not just rebellion, it's strategic rebellion.
It's a calculated rebellion. But amidst this academic sabotage, there was one teacher who actually reached him, a history teacher.
Dr. Leopold Poetsch. He mentions him by name. What was so special about him? Why did this one teacher break through?
Well, according to the text, Poetsch taught him that history wasn't just about memorizing dates and birthdays of monarchs. And he mocks this. He says, when the crown was placed on the brow of some insignificant ruler.
He saw it as trivia.
Right. He says true history is the search for causes and forces. This is where Hitler claims he learned to view history not as a record of the past, but as a weapon for the future.
A weapon for the future. Wow.
He says, and I'm quoting again, "I became a nationalist. I learned to understand and grasp what the true meaning of history." For him, history became the story of racial struggle, not the story of dynasties or nations.
So this teacher, Dr. Poetsch, accidentally or not, gave him the intellectual framework for his later ideology.
He gave him the lens, he taught him to look for the forces behind the events, and Hitler just filled in the blanks with his own ideas about race.
So school was a battleground, home was a battleground, and then everything changes, tragedy strikes.
Yes. First, the father dies suddenly of a stroke. Hitler is 13. This removes the immediate obstacle, the immediate source of conflict.
But it doesn't solve his problems.
Not at all. And then, just 2 years later, his mother dies after a long, painful illness. And he writes about this very differently. He says, "I respected my father, but I loved my mother."
That's a rare moment of what seems like raw, genuine emotion in the text.
It is. It's one of the few places where the political strategist seems to disappear for a sentence or two, and it leaves him alone. He's 18.
Or should.
Family funds are gone due to the medical bills.
Yeah.
He packs a suitcase, grabs his linen, and moves to Vienna. He writes that he had an indomitable resolution to become somebody. He was determined to forestall fate.
And this leads us into part 2 of our discussion, the Vienna years. He calls this chapter Learning and Suffering in Vienna. And boy, does he emphasize the suffering.
Oh, absolutely. He calls Vienna the school of misery. And you have to remember the popular image of Vienna at the time.
Right. It's the city of art, innocent jollity, waltzes, high culture.
For many, it was the jewel of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For Hitler, he says, It was 5 years of hardship and misery. He introduces a character here, a metaphorical character he calls his unsympathetic friend.
Hunger.
Hunger. He says hunger was his faithful guardian. It never left him. It was the only thing he could count on.
It's a very dramatic way of putting it.
It's all about building a persona. He worked as a casual laborer, then a poor painter, selling watercolors of city scenes to tourists. But what's so interesting is how he uses this misery to build his political credibility later on.
He's establishing his credentials as one of the people.
Exactly. He's telling the reader, I know the working class because I was the working class. I lived in the slums. I know what it's like to be cold and hungry. I am not some bourgeois academic in an ivory tower.
He describes the housing conditions in vivid, almost grotesque detail. The overcrowding, the filth, the tenebrous spectacles of ordure. He critiques the bourgeoisie, the middle class, for having no empathy.
He really goes after them. He tells a story about the self-made man who climbs out of poverty and then immediately kicks the ladder down, having zero sympathy for those left behind.
When you read that part, it sounds almost, well, it sounds almost socialist, doesn't it? A critique of class indifference.
On the surface, yes. He's tapping into a very real, very powerful grievance. He's observing the social question, but, and this is the critical but, he pivots.
This is the turn.
This is the turn. He doesn't blame capitalism or the monarchy or the class system. He identifies two perils that he claims he awakened to in Vienna.
Marxism and Judaism.
And in his mind, they become one and the same.
Let's unpack that, because in the text of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, the original Stalag complete edition, he presents this as a gradual realization. He claims he didn't grow up anti-Semitic.
Right. He goes to great lengths to make this point. He says in his father's house, he rarely heard the word Jew. And if he did, he was just referring to a different religion, not a different people.
He even says he initially thought the anti-Semitic press was unworthy of the cultural tradition of a great nation. He paints himself as this open-minded, liberal young man at first.
It's a rhetorical strategy.
Yeah.
He's trying to show the reader that he didn't arrive at his conclusions out of prejudice, but through hard, painful study and observation.
So how does he describe this shift? What's the catalyst in his story?
It starts with his work in the building trades. He describes the Social Democrats, the trade unions. They pressure him to join. He refuses. He gets into arguments with them.
And what's his objection?
He claims they deny the value of the individual, the nation, and the race. He describes them as using terror and intimidation, and then he sees a mass demonstration of workers.
I remember this passage. It's striking.
He calls it a human dragon, uncoiling itself through the streets. And he's both terrified by it, but also, you can tell, he's awestruck by the sheer power of the mass. He's learning.
And he connects this to the press.
Directly. He starts reading the Arbeiterzeitung, the main socialist workers' newspaper. He finds it deceptive, full of what he calls spiritual vitriol. And then he claims to have a physical realization, an epiphany on the street.
The moment in the inner city?
Yes. He describes walking through the inner city and seeing a man in a long caftan with black side locks. And he asks himself two questions. First, is this a Jew? And then, more profoundly for him, is this a German?
And this is where the crystallization happens, the moment he decides they are two separate things.
Exactly. From that moment on, he says he begins to see Jews everywhere. He begins to read everything he can get his hands on. And he constructs this all-encompassing conspiracy theory that links everything he hates.
So he looks at the leaders of the Social Democrats.
Jews, he claims. He looks at the authors of the filthy plays and decadent modern art.
Jews, he claims.
He looks at prostitution, at what he calls the white slave traffic.
And he blames the Jews for that, too.
He creates a closed loop of logic, a feedback loop of hate. If the press lies, it's the Jews. If the workers are agitated against the nation, it's the Jewish leaders of the Marxists.
He writes, and this line is just chilling, knowledge of the Jews is the only key to a true understanding of the inner nature of social democracy.
That is the linchpin of his entire worldview. He strips the political movement, Marxism, of its economic and social ideology and reduces it to a racial conspiracy.
So it's not about a class struggle anymore.
No. He argues that Marxism rejects what he calls the aristocratic principle of nature, which we'll get to later, and replaces it with the dead weight of numbers. And he claims this is a uniquely Jewish idea designed to destroy the Aryan race.
It's a terrifyingly effective narrative device. He starts with, I was poor and hungry, which gains sympathy from the reader, and he ends with, and I found the secret cause of all our hunger and all our problems, this specific group of people.
It's the classic scapegoat mechanism, detailed and rationalized over hundreds of pages. He writes that by resisting the Jew, He is defending the handiwork of the Lord,
He elevates his hatred to a divine mission.
a holy crusade.
So he leaves Vienna. He's completely disillusioned with the Austro-Hungarian state, which he sees as a Babylon of races, a hopeless mixture of peoples. And he moves to Munich in 1912.
Munich, the metropolis of German art. He describes this time, the 2 years before the war, as the happiest and most contented of his life. He felt like he was finally in a truly German city.
He felt at home.
At home. But the geopolitical storm clouds are gathering. And this brings us to part 3 of our discussion, the war, the collapse, and the decision.
World War I. When the news comes that war has broken out in August of 1914, his reaction is, well, it's disturbing, to say the least.
He doesn't feel fear. He doesn't feel dread. He feels deliverance. He writes, I sank down upon my knees and thanked heaven out of the fullness of my heart for the favor of having been permitted to live in such a time.
He thanked heaven for the war. He viewed peace as a time of slow rot, didn't he?
Yes. He hated the peaceful competition of nations. He saw it as corrupt and materialistic. He wanted the test by iron, the great struggle that would forge the nation's soul.
So he enlists immediately.
He petitions King Ludwig III of Bavaria to join a Bavarian regiment, and he's accepted. And his description of the front is stark. He talks about the enthusiasm of the recruits, the singing on the trains, and then the brutal reality of the Flanders mud. He calls it the school of war.
He seems to have thrived in it, though. He was a dispatch runner, a dangerous job. He describes the army as the greatest organization in the world, a heroic body. But then he contrasts it with what he perceived was happening back home.
This is absolutely critical. This is the seed of the stab-in-the-back myth, the Dolchstoss legend.
Explain that for our listeners.
He claims that while the soldiers were holding the line, defending it tooth and nail, as he says, the home front was being poisoned by Marxist agitation. He talks about the munition strikes in 1917 and 1918. He talks about the shirkers who stayed behind.
So in his narrative, the army never really lost on the battlefield.
Never. The army was undefeated, heroic. It was betrayed from within, undermined by the same forces he believed he had discovered in Vienna, the Marxists and the Jews.
And then the end comes for him personally in a very dramatic way. October 1918.
The gas attack. He's caught in a British gas attack near Ypres in Belgium. He describes his eyes turning into glowing coals. He goes temporarily blind.
A very symbolic injury.
Incredibly symbolic. He's evacuated to a hospital in Passwalk in Pomerania.
And while he's lying there, blind, recovering his sight, the news arrives. The revolution in Germany. The Kaiser has abdicated. The war is over. Germany has lost.
He describes this as the ultimate collapse. Everything went black again before my eyes. He says he staggered back to his ward, buried his head in his pillow, and cried for the first time since his mother's death.
And in that moment, in the hospital bed.
In that darkness, in that total despair, he makes the decision that changes the course of history. He writes, I decided to become a politician.
It's such a cinematic, almost unbelievable moment in the text. The blind soldier is seeing a vision of his future, a new mission.
He frames it as a moment of destiny. All his past suffering, all his learning in Vienna, it was all preparation for this moment. The time for talk was over. It was time for action.
So he returns to Munich. The war is lost. The revolution is chaotic. He gets a job with the army, essentially as an education officer, which really meant being a political informant, spying on all the new political groups popping up.
And this is what leads him to the German Labor Party, the DAP.
A tiny, insignificant group at the time.
It was tiny. He describes a meeting in a back room of a beer hall with barely anyone there, maybe 20, 25 people. He calls it the Society of the Honest. He was unimpressed initially.
But something caught his attention.
He attends a meeting, and someone gets up and advocates for Bavaria to break away from Germany. And Hitler, the fanatical pan-German nationalist, can't stand it. He gets up, gives a fiery rebuttal, and impresses the party's founders. They invite him to join.
He tells that famous or infamous anecdote about the mouse here, doesn't he?
Yes, the mouse in the barracks. It's such a strange little story to include. He's living in a small room in the barracks, waking up at 5 a.m., and he watches mice playing with little crusts of bread he leaves out for them.
And he says what?
He says, I had suffered so many privations in my own life that I could well picture the pleasure these little creatures were experiencing.
Why include a story about feeding mice in a political manifesto? What's the purpose of that?
It's a brilliant rhetorical tactic. It humanizes him. It reminds the reader of his poverty, his common man status. It says, I am not a general or a wealthy politician from a castle. I am the guy who was so poor and lonely that he shared his crusts with mice.
It builds trust with the working class reader.
It builds an emotional connection before he hits them with a heavy abstract ideology. It's disarming.
And he joins this tiny party, member number 7.
He was actually member number 7 of the executive committee, which made him one of the leaders from the start.
Ugh.
And he takes it over. He completely transforms it from a sleepy debating society into a fighting movement.
And he does this through a very specific and very cynical understanding of communication. This brings us to part 4, the spoken word and the psychology of propaganda.
This section of the book honestly gave me chills reading it again. It is a cold, calculated manual for mass manipulation. He is incredibly blunt about how to control a crowd.
He doesn't hide it at all.
Not one bit. He starts by analyzing Allied propaganda from World War I, which he admired, and German propaganda, which he thought was a failure.
Why did he think the German propaganda failed?
Because it was too intellectual. It was written by academics for other academics. He dismisses the intellectuals entirely. He says propaganda is not for them. Propaganda must appeal to the masses.
And his definition of the masses is incredibly insulting.
He defines the masses as a vacillating crowd of human children. He sees them as feminine, driven by emotion, not reason.
Human children! That is so condescending, yet he used that belief to build a massive following.
He argues that because the understanding of the masses is small, their forgetfulness is great. Therefore, effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points.
And repeated over and over again.
And must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand. Repetition, subjectivity, simplicity.
He talks about what he calls the error of objectivity. What does he mean by that?
Right. He says if you are advertising soap, you don't say, well, our soup is good, but this other brand is also okay. You say, our soap is the only soap. It is the best.
You present your product as uniquely superior.
He applies this directly to war and politics. He says admitting the enemy has any justice on their side, even a tiny bit, is a fatal mistake because it shakes the confidence of your own people.
So you have to paint the world in absolute black and white, no nuance, no shades of gray.
None. The enemy is pure evil. Your cause is pure good, and it must be emotional, not rational.
And he prioritizes the spoken word over the written word. He says, great movements are driven by great speakers, not great writers.
Yes, and this is crucial to understanding the rise of the Nazi Party. He believed the written word only reaches those who are already somewhat convinced. But a great speaker can convert the doubters.
Why? What's the magic of speech for him?
Because, he argues, in a speech, you can see the audience, you can feel their reaction, you can read their faces. If they don't understand, you explain it more simply. If they are bored, you change your tone and raise your voice. You can overcome their individual will with what he calls the magic influence of the crowd.
He's talking about crowd psychology.
Exactly. He describes the mass meeting as a place where the lonely, isolated individual who feels small and weak at home or at work suddenly feels the strength of being part of a huge, powerful body. Their doubts are washed away by the collective emotion.
And he deliberately held meetings at night. That wasn't an accident, was it?
No, he states it explicitly. He says people's willpower and resistance are lower in the evening after a hard day's work. They're more susceptible to the will of a stronger personality.
It's dark, it's calculated, it's not accidental.
None of it was accidental. Every detail was planned for maximum psychological effect.
Okay, so he has the method, which is propaganda. Now, what is the core message? This is where we need to dive deep into part 5. Ideology, race, state, and the Volkisch concept.
This is the core. This is the engine of the whole machine. Chapter 11, Nation and Race. He starts not with politics or economics, but with what he calls nature's aristocratic principle.
So he's trying to ground his ideology in science, or what he presents as science.
Pseudoscience, really.
Yeah.
He looks at the animal kingdom and says, a titmouse meets with a titmouse, a wolf with a wolf. Nature, he argues, isolates species. And he believes the same iron law applies to humanity.
He's taking a very basic biological observation and forcing it onto complex human sociology.
Exactly. And he takes it a step further. He says nature is a constant struggle for existence, and the stronger must dominate the weaker. That's the law of life.
So any attempt to help the weak is unnatural.
It's a crime against nature, in his view. He argues that humanitarianism, the idea of helping the weak, is a violation of nature's will. If you help the weak survive and reproduce, you weaken the overall strength of the strong. It's extreme social Darwinism.
And from this law, he divides humanity into 3 categories.
Yes. The founders of culture, the bearers of culture, and the destroyers of culture.
The founders being the Aryans, of course.
Yes. He claims, without any historical or anthropological evidence, that everything good art, science, technology comes from the singular genius of the Aryan race.
And the destroyer, in his worldview,
Is the Jew. He defines the Aryan by the concept of self-preservation through service. He says the Aryan is idealistic, willing to sacrifice himself and die for the community.
And how does he define the Jewish instinct for self-preservation?
He claims it's strictly egoistic. He argues the Jew has no idealism, no sense of community beyond his own race, and no connection to the soil.
He uses the word parasite. He calls the Jew a parasite in the body of other nations. It's dehumanizing language meant to justify. Well, we know exactly what it was meant to justify.
The language is the first step. If you can convince people that a group isn't fully human, then you can do anything to them.
And this racial theory then informs his definition of the state. This is crucial.
This is one of the most important concepts in the book. He says the state is not an economic unit. It's not a business. It's not just a collection of people within a border.
So what is it?
The state is a vessel. The content of the vessel is the race. The state exists for one purpose and one purpose only, to preserve and purify the racial stock.
So if the state isn't serving the race, in his view, the state is illegitimate.
Completely illegitimate and must be overthrown. He mocks the bourgeois idea of the state as just a guarantor of law and order and economic prosperity. He wants a Volkish state, a racial state.
And this leads to his distinction on citizenship, which is terrifying.
Yes. He said simply being born in Germany shouldn't make you a citizen. By birth, you are merely a subject of the state.
A subject?
You only become a full citizen with rights after a formal process. You must be racially pure, physically and mentally healthy, complete your military service, and then you are solemnly granted a diploma of citizenship. It's an exclusive club you have to earn entry into.
It's a terrifying blueprint for a caste system, written right there in plain sight. And to enforce this vision, you need organization. Which brings us to part 6, building the movement.
He realized very early on that ideas aren't enough. You can't win a revolution from a debating society. You need physical power. You need muscle.
Which is why he founded the SA, the stormtroops, the brown shirts.
Exactly. But he's very specific about their purpose. The SA was not a secret society like the Freemasons, and it was not a quiet defense league.
What was it then?
It was an instrument for the domination of the street. His philosophy was blunt. He writes, "Terror is broken only by terror." He wanted his men to be visible, loud, and physically intimidating.
He was baiting the opposition.
He wanted to provoke the Marxists, the communists, into attacking his meetings so that his SA could beat them back, throw them out, and look like heroes defending free speech. It was all political theater.
And the branding. We have to talk about the branding, the flag, the symbols.
He devotes a whole section to this. He knew the power of symbols. He chose the red flag explicitly to provoke the socialists. They saw red as their color. He stole it.
He co-opted their most powerful symbol.
And then he put the white circle in the middle for nationalism and the black swastika for what he called the mission of the struggle for the victory of the Aryan man.
He obsessed over the dimensions, the color contrast.
He writes about it like a graphic designer.
Yeah.
He knew that a powerful banner, a powerful symbol, bypasses the rational brain and hits the emotions directly. It creates a sense of belonging and identity.
He essentially designed a corporate identity for a political revolution.
He did. And he structured the party on the Führer principle, the leadership principle. No committees, no voting on decisions. The leader decides, and the leader takes absolute and sole responsibility.
He hated parliaments. He called it a system of cowardice.
He wanted a clear hierarchy of command, just like in the army. He also made a distinction between followers and members.
What's the difference?
A follower is someone who agrees with the movement. A member is someone who fights for it. He wanted the core organization, the membership, to remain small and elite, a band of dedicated fighters, while the following could grow into the millions.
So we have the man, the method, the ideology, and the organization. Now, where does he want to take Germany? What's the end game? This is part 7, foreign policy and the future.
This is where the book moves from domestic revolution to global conquest. He flatly rejects the borders of 1914, before World War I. He says they were illogical and inadequate for the German people.
He wants more territory. He wants Lebensraum.
Living space. That is the ultimate goal, and he's very clear about where he intends to get it.
He looks east.
He looks to Russia. He writes, in one of the most chilling lines, "The plow is then the sword," meaning we will conquer the land with our armies, and our farmers will follow to cultivate it.
So he's not interested in overseas colonies like Britain or France.
No. He explicitly rejects that. He argues Germany made a mistake before 1914 trying to compete with Britain on trade and naval power. He says Germany's future is as a continental power. He wants the vast agricultural lands of Ukraine and Russia.
And he justifies this by claiming Russia is weak and ripe for the taking.
Yes, he ties his racial theory directly to geopolitics. He claims that the Russian state was only strong because of its Germanic nucleus and aristocrats. But now, he says, that has been exterminated by the Bolshevik Revolution and replaced by a Jewish clique.
So he sees Russia as a state ruled by his ultimate enemy.
A state ruled by a Jewish ferment of decomposition, as he puts it. So for him, taking Russia isn't just conquest for resources, it's a racial and ideological crusade to crush his ultimate enemy.
And allies. Who does he think Germany should work with to achieve this?
This is really interesting from a strategic point of view. He identifies two potential allies, Italy and England.
Italy makes sense with Mussolini. But England, weren't they the enemy in World War I?
Yes, but he was a pragmatist in this sense. He saw France as the mortal enemy, the eternal nation that always wants to dismember and weaken Germany. He believed England's interest was in maintaining a balance of power in Europe, which meant they would never want France to be too strong.
So he thought he could convince England to stand aside or even join him as long as he didn't challenge their naval and colonial empire.
Exactly. And to secure an alliance with Italy, he was willing to make a very controversial sacrifice, formally renouncing any claim to the South Tyrol region, which was a German-speaking area that Italy had annexed after World War I.
That must have been unpopular with German nationalists.
It was. But it shows his absolute focus. He was a fanatic, but he was a strategic fanatic. He was willing to make tactical trades to get the big prize, the East.
There's a chapter where he writes, "The strong are stronger without allies." That seems contradictory.
That's about the movement in its early days. He believed a political movement must fight alone to maintain its purity and radicalism. But for the state, for geopolitics, he knew he needed alliances to isolate France and give him a free hand to strike east.
So we've walked through the text, we've seen the entire arc, from the boy in Braunau on the Inn, to the hungry artist in Vienna, to the blind soldier in Pasewalk, to the demagogue in the Munich beer hall.
And finally, to the prisoner in Landsberg Fortress, dictating this very book to his loyal deputy, Rudolf Hess.
Right. We have to remember the context of its creation. He wrote this in prison after the failed beer hall putsch in 1923. He was down, but he was very far from being out. He was writing the manual for his comeback.
And that is the synthesis of our whole discussion today. The mission of the book, as he himself states it, was to provide the building stones for the movement.
It wasn't just a memoir for vanity.
Not at all. It was a foundational document, a textbook for revolution. He was documenting the struggle so far to create a template for all future members of the party.
It's disturbing how transparent he was about his goals. People often say, well, we didn't know what he was going to do, but it's all here.
It is all here. The destruction of democracy, the implementation of racial laws, the conquest of Russia, the use of political terror. He wrote it all down in 1924, 9 years before he took power.
This brings us to the application for you, the listener.
Right.
Why spend such a significant amount of time discussing this dark, difficult text?
Because we have to understand the mechanics. We have to challenge ourselves to analyze how these mechanisms of mass psychology and propaganda actually work. When Hitler writes about simplifying the message, about appealing to emotion over reason, about creating a simplistic us versus them narrative, those are tactics that did not die in 1945.
They are universal tools of manipulation. You see them everywhere, even today, in different forms.
Precisely. Studying this book is a case study in how a toxic ideology is constructed and sold to millions. It shows how a real grievance like poverty or national humiliation after a war can be identified, amplified, and then weaponized.
It shows how a conspiracy theory is built to explain a complex, confusing world with a simple, satisfying, but dangerous lie.
So it's a lesson in critical thinking. The ultimate lesson, perhaps. If we can understand how the trick works, how the manipulation is engineered, we are much less likely to fall for it, no matter who is using it.
Let this knowledge enhance your life by making you a more critical observer of the political and social messages that are directed at you every single day.
That is the hope. We treat this book not as a scripture to be revered or banned, but as evidence, a piece of evidence from a historical crime scene, a warning sign from history.
And for those of you who really want to grapple with this historical document directly, we are talking about Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, the original Stalag Complete Edition. It is available for purchase for those who want to study the source material firsthand.
It is a heavy read in every sense of the word. It's dense, it's repetitive, and it's obviously filled with vile hatred. But for the serious student of history or political science, there is no substitute for reading the primary source.
We want to know what stood out to you in this discussion. How does hearing the internal logic, the twisted but internally consistent logic of the text, change your understanding of that period? Connect with us on social media and let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear them.
It really raises the final question, doesn't it? How fragile is a democracy when it is faced with a movement and a leader who understands the psychology of the masses so ruthlessly and is willing to exploit it without any moral restraint?
That is the question to leave on. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Playing Books podcast. If you found this discussion valuable, please follow, subscribe, and share the show. It really does help us keep digging into these important texts.
Thank you. Keep reading and keep questioning.
See you next time.